The flies arrived before the troopers did. Thick black clouds settling on upturned boots and charred canvas in the pre-dawn stillness of Cattle Creek Station. This is the story of how 23 settlers vanished from the Northern Territory Outback in 1907, and what authorities found when they finally rode in 3 weeks too late to ask questions of the living. The smell hit Constable William Farnsworth first. Wood smoke braided with something sweetly wrong, riding the October heat like a warning. He'd ridden from Catherine with 2 Aboriginal trackers and another constable, following reports that Cattle Creek Station had gone silent. No supply requests, no mail, just the emptiness that fills spaces where voices should be. When they crested the red dirt ridge overlooking the compound, the trackers, both Jawoyn men who knew this country, bone deep, stopped their horses without being asked. One pointed at the ground near the station's cattle yards. The earth was painted, not with ochre for ceremony, but with something that drew different flies. The station itself sprawled across what the Jawoyn called Gurinji, a waterhole site, where the ancestors had walked during the dreaming, marking the land with stories older than anyone could count. Thomas Hartwell had chosen the location in 1903 precisely because Aboriginal people avoided it after sunset. Good grazing, he'd written to investors in Adelaide. The natives won't cause trouble where their spirits walk. He'd built his empire on that assumption. 14,000 head of cattle, timber yards, a 2-story homestead with glass windows shipped from Sydney, and quarters for 20 permanent workers, stockmen, drovers, a cook, 2 housekeepers, Hartwell's wife and 3 children, and an overseer named Gerard Mallock, who enforced station rules with fists and branding irons alike. By October 1907, Cattle Creek was the territory's 3rd largest operation, profitable enough that Adelaide investors never questioned Hartwell's methods. From the Catherine Times, September 28, 1907, Cattle Creek Station reports record profits. Manager Thomas Hartwell credits firm management of native labor for success. Farnsworth dismounted at the station gate. The yard stood empty, unusual for mid-morning, when cattle should have been mustered for branding. The main house's front door hung open, swaying slightly in the thermal wind. Inside the compound, he counted 11 bodies. Before I go deeper into what happened at Cattle Creek, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, stories that challenge what we think we know about colonial Australia, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in territory archives for over a century. The bodies had been arranged. That detail appeared in Farnsworth's official report, though heavily redacted before publication. Each settler had been tied with their own station rope, suspended from the cattle yard railings upside down, the way Hartwell hung kangaroo carcasses for butchering. Their skin bore marks, not random violence, but deliberate symbols painted in red ochre, the traditional clay used in Jawoyn ceremony, and burned into several torsos. The Cattle Creek brand, an interlocking HC, applied with the same iron Mallock had used on Aboriginal workers caught attempting to leave. Farnsworth found Thomas Hartwell near the homestead veranda. The station manager's body showed no external wounds, but his head was missing, severed cleanly, the cauterized neck suggesting heat rather than blades. The 2 Jawoyn trackers refused to enter the compound. When Farnsworth pressed them, the elder, a man named Barroway, spoke carefully in Mission English. This place got payback now. Wrong business. Been done here long time. Country, take it back. What happens when you build prosperity on stolen sacred ground? When you brand human beings like livestock? When you ignore every warning that some boundary should never be crossed? Farnsworth would spend 3 weeks documenting the massacre site, photographing evidence that would later disappear from official files. But one detail haunted him more than the bodies, more than the ochre symbols, more than the missing head. In the station's locked office, he found Mallock's ledger, and the entries stopped making sense. The ink was wrong. That's what Constable Farnsworth noticed first, running his finger across Gerard Malek's final entries. The overseer had kept meticulous records: cattle counts, ration distributions, worker assignments logged in perfect copperplate script. But the last 3 pages showed handwriting that deteriorated from controlled precision to frantic scrawl, as if written by different men or one man losing his grip on something fundamental. The office sat at the eastern corner of the homestead, its louvered windows designed to catch the morning breeze. Now they admitted only the stench of decay and the persistent drone of blowflies. Farnsworth spread the ledger across Malek's desk, careful not to disturb the dried blood spatters that formed constellations across the mahogany surface. The entries painted a picture of station life in the months before the massacre, a portrait that contradicted everything Hartwell had reported to Adelaide investors. August 3rd, 1907. 6 workers failed to return from North Paddock muster. Track to Waterhole. Will not cross the singing stones. Applied standard discipline. 3 remain unconscious. Hartwell says, make example. August 17th. Native woman died in quarters. 3rd this month. Doctor won't come from Catherine anymore. Says we're cursed. Hartwell burned the body before dawn. The Jawan trackers had told Farnsworth about the singing stones, a series of boulders arranged in a semicircle around Gurindji Waterhole, each carved with patterns that predated European arrival by thousands of years. According to Barroway, those stones marked the boundary between living country and ancestor country, places where the Dreamtime pressed close enough to bleed through. Crossing that boundary without proper ceremony was like walking into a house uninvited, the kind of insult that demanded response. Hartwell had driven his cattle across those stones daily. From the Northern Territory Times, July 12, 1907. Aboriginal workers at remote stations increasingly reluctant to perform duties. Territory administrator recommends stronger enforcement of master-servant laws. Farnsworth flipped forward. September's entries grew stranger. Malek documented sounds in the night, not the usual dingo calls or cattle lowing, but rhythmic percussion that seemed to come from the earth itself. Workers reported seeing lights moving through the scrub beyond the compound, though patrols found no campfires. Hartwell ordered double watches. The lights continued. September 23rd. Hartwell found 3 cattle with throats opened. Clean cuts, no struggle, blood gone. Trackers refused to examine sight. One said the land is drinking. I flogged him publicly. Others watched in silence. Their silence frightens me more than their anger ever did. The handwriting changed after that entry. Letters began to slant, overlap, as if Malek's hand had forgotten its training. Farnsworth recognized the degradation. He'd seen similar patterns in the journals of prospectors who'd stayed too long in the desert. Men whose minds had cooked under the territory sun until they could no longer distinguish memory from hallucination. But Malek's final entries suggested something different than heat madness. October 1st, 1907. They're inside the compound now. Hartwell sees nothing. I see them in the corners, painted for ceremony. They watch us eat. They watch us sleep. Mrs. Hartwell asked why I keep looking at empty air. I couldn't tell her what fills it. The land is drinking. Farnsworth set down the ledger. Outside, his fellow constable was photographing the cattle yards, the chemical flash of magnesium powder punctuating the afternoon heat. The Jawoin trackers sat their horses at the compound gate, refusing to dismount, their expressions unreadable. One held a string of carved wood pieces, message sticks. Farnsworth knew, though he didn't understand the language they carried. He returned to the ledger's final page. The entry was dated October 15th, 4 days before silence fell over Cattle Creek Station. The handwriting was barely legible. Letters scattered across the page like dropped sticks. Hartwell is branding them tonight. Says we need to reassert authority. 23 workers lined up by the yards. I told him this would break something that can't be fixed. He called me weak. said the territory belongs to men who can hold it. The stones are singing louder now. I can feel it in my teeth. Below that, a single line in different ink, possibly added later, God forgive us. We should never have built here. The ledger contained no entries after October 15th. What drives men to ignore warnings written in the land itself, to mistake silence for submission, to confuse power with permission? Farnsworth closed the ledger and walked outside, where the afternoon sun turned the red dirt the color of old rust. The cattle yard stood empty except for the ropes that still hung from the railings, swaying slightly though no wind moved through the compound. He counted the ropes 23, one for each body found. But official reports would later claim only 11 settlers died at Cattle Creek. Someone had removed 12 bodies before authorities arrived, and Farnsworth was beginning to understand who and why. The photographs told two different stories, and only one would reach Adelaide. Constable Farnsworth's official documentation showed 11 bodies. Thomas Hartwell and his immediate household, Gerard Mallock, 3 stockmen who'd lived in the homestead quarters, and 4 domestic workers, all white settlers, whose deaths would demand government response and newspaper coverage. Clean numbers for a clean narrative about Aboriginal uprising and settler martyrdom. But Farnsworth's private notebook, discovered decades later in his granddaughter's attic, contained different arithmetic. 23 ropes hung from the cattle yard railings. 23 ochre-painted symbols marked the dirt where bodies had lain. And in the workers' quarters, a separate compound of bark huts behind the main station, he'd found evidence of 12 more deaths, though no bodies remained. The quarters sat downwind from the homestead, positioned to catch the smell of the cattle yards and the smoke from the station's rendering pit. Inside the largest hut, Farnsworth discovered sleeping mats arranged in rows, cooking pots still containing cold damper, and a collection of personal items that Aboriginal workers weren't officially allowed to own. Carved message sticks, small bags of ochre, shells that must have traveled hundreds of miles from the coast through trade networks older than any European map. From Farnsworth's private journal, October 22, 1907, found children's toys in the quarters. Hartwell's ledgers never mentioned families. How do you account for people the records pretend don't exist? The answer was simple. You don't. The 12 missing bodies belonged to Aboriginal workers who'd been listed in station records only as numbered assets, their names reduced to designations like Tracker 3 or Yardman 7. When they died, whether from disease, exhaustion, or violence, station managers rarely reported the losses. Workers were replaceable, drawn from communities desperate for food rations, or coerced through master-servant laws that made leaving employment a criminal offense. But these 12 hadn't died from station brutality. They'd been taken. Barroway, the Jawan tracker, finally agreed to examine the workers' quarters on the 3rd day of investigation. He moved through the space slowly, reading signs Farnsworth couldn't see, occasionally touching objects with a reverence that suggested recognition. When he emerged, his face carried an expression Farnsworth would later describe as satisfied grief. Your people got judged, Barroway said, pointing toward the empty cattle yards. My people got taken home. The distinction was crucial. The 11 white settlers had been killed at the massacre site, their bodies left as evidence and warning. The 12 Aboriginal workers had been removed before authorities arrived, carried away by their own people for proper ceremony, for return to country, for the kind of burial that acknowledged them as human beings rather than station property. Farnsworth began to understand the mathematics of the attack. This hadn't been random violence or spontaneous uprising. Someone had known exactly who lived at Cattle Creek Station, who deserved punishment and who deserved rescue, who would be counted by colonial authorities and who had never been counted at all. The question was, who had planned it with such precision? The cattle yards provided answers written in symbols Farnsworth couldn't read but could photograph. Each of the 11 hanging points bore painted marks, circles, lines, cross-hatched patterns that seemed to correspond to specific individuals. Malik's rope showed a symbol resembling a branding iron crossed with what might have been tears or falling water. Hartwell's displayed concentric circles that Barroway identified as representing the waterhole the sacred site Cattle Creek Station had violated, but the most elaborate symbol appeared on the gatepost nearest the workers' quarters, a human figure painted in white ochre, arms raised, surrounded by smaller figures in red. Farnsworth asked Barroway what it meant. "That one tell the story," the tracker said. "Big man, he got power from country. Little ones, he bring them back. This mark say, the land got memory, and the land got law. Country remembers everything." The symbol suggested organization beyond anything the Territory Administration wanted to acknowledge. Colonial officials preferred to characterize Aboriginal resistance as primitive, emotional, disorganized, easy to suppress with sufficient force. But the Cattle Creek attack showed strategic planning, detailed knowledge of station routines, and sophisticated coordination between groups who could move through the landscape invisibly while carrying out a precisely timed operation. Farnsworth spent another week searching the surrounding country for clues about how attackers had entered the compound, where they'd taken the 12 workers' bodies, whether any witnesses remained. He found nothing, except more questions. The singing stones near Gurindji Waterhole showed evidence of recent ceremony. Fresh ochre paintings, cleared ground where dancers' feet had marked patterns, but no tracks led back to Cattle Creek. It was as if the attackers had emerged from the earth itself, done their work, and been reabsorbed into the landscape. On October 29th, a rider arrived from Catherine with orders to conclude the investigation. The Territory Administrator wanted Farnsworth back in town, wanted this incident documented and closed before it damaged investor confidence or triggered demands for expensive military intervention. The official report would emphasize Aboriginal savagery, settler victimhood, and the need for stronger control measures. Nothing about sacred sites violated. Nothing about workers branded like cattle. Nothing about the 12 people who'd been invisible in life and would remain invisible in death. How many stories get buried beneath official reports? How many truths dissolve in the territory dust because acknowledging them would require admitting what was built here and on whose bones it stands? Farnsworth packed his evidence, knowing most of it would never reach the public record. But he kept the photographs, kept his private journal, kept the nagging certainty that the Cattle Creek Massacre had been justice by a law older than any parliament could write. As he rode away from the abandoned station, he looked back once at the compound, where flies still worked their patient cleanup, where ropes still swayed from railings, where the singing stones continued their frequency that only certain ears could hear. He didn't see the figure watching from the ridge, a man painted for ceremony, holding what appeared to be a hollow vessel fashioned from bone. But his horse saw it and refused to move forward until Farnsworth turned away from looking back. 3 months passed before anyone found Gerard Malik's head, and the manner of its discovery would haunt the Territory Police for decades. A prospector named Dutch Heinrich was following a quartz vein through the sandstone escarpments 15 miles northwest of Cattle Creek when his dog disappeared into a crevice barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. Heinrich heard barking echo from somewhere deep in the rock, followed by a yelp that suggested the animal had found something worth fleeing. When he finally squeezed through the opening, carbide lamp held forward, he entered a gallery that Aboriginal people had been using for ceremony since before the last ice age. The walls were covered in ochre paintings, handprints, spirit figures, scenes of hunting and creation. Heinrich had seen similar art in caves throughout the territory, but never a chamber of this size or complexity. The ceiling rose 20 feet overhead, natural columns of limestone creating a cathedral effect. The floor was worn smooth from thousands of years of feet, performing rituals whose meanings had been passed down through generations that predated European arrival by millennia. At the chamber's center sat a water bowl carved from stone, positioned to catch drips from overhead seepage. The bowl was filled with clean water, despite the October dry season, fed by some underground spring that made this place a permanent resource in an otherwise harsh landscape. Heinrich's dog stood at the bowl's edge, whimpering. The prospector approached, lamp raised, and saw what floated in the water: a human skull, bleached white by lime deposits, eye sockets staring upward at the painted ceiling. From the Catherine Times, February 8, 1908. Prospector reports grisly discovery in cave system. Skull identified as belonging to Gerard Mallock, overseer at Cattle Creek Station. Aboriginal artifacts found at scene suggest ritual use. The article neglected to mention what Heinrich told police in private. The skull showed no signs of forced entry or violent removal. The cervical vertebrae were cleanly separated, cut with precision, that suggested someone had known exactly where to sever spinal connections. More disturbing, the skull's interior surface showed marks consistent with scraping, deliberate cleaning, as if someone had removed all soft tissue to prepare the bone for ceremonial purpose. Sergeant Miles Hutchinson led the recovery team that retrieved the skull in February 1908. He brought 2 constables and, reluctantly, Barraway as guide. The Jawine tracker had been cooperative during the initial Cattle Creek investigation, but this cave was different territory, literally. The escarpment belonged to a different clan group, one with whom Barraway's people maintained complex relationships of obligation and avoidance. "That place not for me to walk," Barraway said when Hutchinson first requested his assistance. "That place belonged to Wardaman people. They got their own law," Hutchinson insisted. The Territory Administration needed Aboriginal cooperation for the investigation, needed someone who could read the symbols and explain what ritual had been performed. Barraway finally agreed, but only after sending sticks to Wardaman elders asking permission, a courtesy that puzzled Hutchinson until they reached the cave entrance. 2 Wardaman men waited there, painted for ceremony, carrying spears that weren't exactly pointed at the police party, but weren't exactly pointed away either. A conversation happened in language Hutchinson couldn't follow, tones ranging from respectful inquiry to firm boundary setting. Eventually, Barraway turned to the sergeant. "They let you take the skull, but they tell you why it's here, and you don't put that in your report. Why would a skull become sacred?" The explanation came slowly, translated through Barraway's careful English. The cave had been used for punishment ceremony, not Aboriginal punishment, but judgment against those who violated the deepest laws. When someone committed crimes that damaged country itself, crimes that threatened the balance between living world and spirit world, their body parts could be transformed from instruments of harm into instruments of healing. The skull that had commanded brutality at Cattle Creek Station had been cleansed, consecrated, and converted into a vessel that gave life through water. The irony was deliberate. The head that had ordered thirst for Aboriginal workers now provided drink in a sacred place. This wasn't desecration. It was transformation through ceremony, punishment that acknowledged even the worst person contained something that could be purified and returned to proper purpose. The skull would remain in the cave for years, serving travelers who knew the waterhole's location, until the bone itself dissolved back into the limestone from which it had been carved, completing a cycle of return that European minds struggled to comprehend. Hutchinson recovered the skull over Wardaman objections. Protocol demanded evidence be secured, cataloged, eventually buried in the Catherine Cemetery beside a headstone that read, "Gerard Mallock, died October 1907. Faithful servant of progress." No mention of how he died. No mention of what his skull had become. But something else troubled Hutchinson more than the skull's ceremonial use. The cave showed signs of recent occupation: fire pits, food remains, sleeping areas. Someone had been living there regularly, possibly during the period when Cattle Creek Station was attacked. The Wardaman men confirmed that yes, people sometimes sheltered in the cave during ceremony season, but no, they couldn't say who or when or whether any connection existed to events 15 miles south. The wall paintings provided the only testimony. Near the chamber's eastern corner, Hutchinson found fresh ochre art images that hadn't been there during previous territory surveys of the area. The painting showed human figures, some upside down, some marked with geometric patterns that resembled cattle brands. Above them, a larger figure with raised arms, identical to the symbol Farnsworth had photographed at Cattle Creek. This was documentation. This was history recorded in the same medium Aboriginal people had used for tens of thousands of years. The massacre painted into permanent record on stone that would outlast any European archive. Who was the figure with raised arms? The one who appeared at Cattle Creek and now again in this sacred cave. The one whose image seemed to bridge the world of action and the world of story. Hutchinson ordered the paintings photographed, but didn't include them in his official report. Too many questions they raised. Too many implications about organization and planning that contradicted the narrative of spontaneous Aboriginal violence. Better to retrieve Malik's skull, close the case, and let the cave keep its secrets. As the police party prepared to leave, one of the Wardaman men spoke directly to Hutchinson in broken English, a rare gesture, since most Aboriginal people found it safer to communicate through intermediaries. "That one in the paintings," the man said, pointing to the figure with raised arms. "He's still out there. He's still watching. Country not finished with judgment yet." The sergeant dismissed this as superstition, the kind of mystical thinking that made Aboriginal people unreliable witnesses. But writing back to Catherine, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd missed something crucial in that cave. Some piece of information painted right there on the walls, but invisible to eyes, trained to see only what they already believed. Behind them, the cave entrance swallowed the afternoon light like a mouth closing. And somewhere in the escarpment's labyrinth of passages, in chambers that didn't appear on any government map, the story of Cattle Creek Station continued to be told in ochre and firelight, passed to the next generation of people who understood that justice sometimes arrives on a timeline measured not in months or years, but in the slow turning of country itself, patient as limestone, inevitable as erosion. Sarah Watkins wasn't supposed to be at Cattle Creek Station on October 15, 1907, but a broken wagon axle had stranded her there for 3 days. 3 days that would make her the only European survivor of what happened that night. She was a governess traveling from Darwin to a pastoral property near Tennant Creek, riding with a supply wagon that serviced remote stations along the stock route. The axle snapped 40 miles north of Cattle Creek, and the teamster, a man named Bill Corrigan, decided to limp the damaged wagon to Hartwell Station rather than attempt repairs in open country. They arrived on October 13th, were received with the cold hospitality that characterized Hartwell's dealings with unexpected guests, and were told the wagon could be fixed in 2 days if the station blacksmith found time between other duties. From Sarah Watkins's testimony to the Darwin magistrate, March 1908, Mr. Hartwell was not a welcoming host. He made clear we were an inconvenience and should stay out of his business. I was given a cot in the kitchen house. Mr. Corrigan slept with his wagon. The kitchen house stood separate from the main homestead, a safety measure against fire, but also a social boundary that kept domestic workers at proper distance from the family quarters. Sarah shared the space with 2 Aboriginal women who worked as cook and housemaid, women whose names she never learned, because Hartwell referred to them only as the kitchen girl and the other one. The women spoke little English, or pretended not to, which Sarah would later understand as survival strategy rather than ignorance. On October 15th, she witnessed something that didn't appear in any official report. Gerard Malik conducting what he called discipline assembly in the cattle yards at dusk. The yards were lit by kerosene torches, their flames casting shadows that made the assembled Aboriginal workers look like figures from a fever dream. Sarah watched from the kitchen house window as Malik ordered 23 men and women to line up beside the branding chute. The same apparatus used to process cattle, now turned toward a different purpose. Hartwell stood nearby, arms crossed, face set in an expression Sarah described as righteously angry, like an Old Testament patriarch about to deliver judgment. What happened next would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Malik heated the station's branding iron in a portable forge, the HC symbol glowing orange-red in the gathering darkness. One by one, workers were forced to the ground while the hot iron was pressed against their skin, not on hidden places, but on arms and faces where the marks would be visible, permanent reminders of who held power at Cattle Creek Station. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the ever-present smell of cattle and dust. Some workers cried out, others endured in silence that seemed more terrible than screaming. I wanted to intervene, Sarah testified months later, her hands shaking as she gripped the witness stand rail. God help me, I wanted to stop it. But Mr. Corrigan pulled me from the window and told me to be silent, unless I wanted to join them. I was a coward. I watched and did nothing. Would you have intervened, knowing it might cost your life? Would you have stayed silent, carrying that guilt forward forever? Or would you have found some third option that history hasn't recorded, because silence is easier to document than small acts of resistance? After the branding, Hartwell addressed the workers in the pidgin English used across the territory to communicate with Aboriginal people, a deliberately simplified language that reinforced assumptions about intelligence and capacity. But Sarah noticed something Hartwell didn't. The workers understood perfectly. Their eyes tracked his words with comprehension that suggested they'd simply learned to hide their knowledge, to let white settlers believe what they wanted to believe about Aboriginal ignorance. You belong to this station, Hartwell said, his voice carrying across the yards. You work for me until I say different. Try to leave, you get branded again. Cause trouble, you get worse. This is my land now, my cattle, my rules. The workers were dismissed to their quarters. Sarah returned to her cot, nauseated and ashamed, unable to eat the damper the kitchen women offered. She lay awake, listening to sounds from the workers' compound, not crying, not rage, but singing. Low voices in language she couldn't understand, rising and falling in patterns that seemed less like melody and more like message, rhythm carrying information across the darkness to ears that knew how to receive it. The singing stopped at midnight. Sarah dozed fitfully, woken periodically by the shifting of the kitchen house's timber frame as it cooled in the night air. Around 3 a.m. on October 16th, she woke to different sounds, footsteps, many of them, moving through the compound with purpose, but not panic. She went to the window. The cattle yards were filled with figures painted in white ochre, their bodies decorated with patterns that seemed to glow in the starlight. They moved between buildings, with the coordination of people following a rehearsed plan, entering the homestead through doors that shouldn't have been unlocked, emerging with settlers who walked ahead of them docilely, as if drugged or dreaming. Sarah counted at least 30 painted figures, though movement and shadow made exact numbers impossible to determine. She watched them bring Hartwell and his family to the cattle yards, watched them secure Malik and the stockmen to the branding railings, watched them work with efficiency that suggested this wasn't spontaneous violence, but carefully orchestrated ceremony. The 2 Aboriginal women who worked in the kitchen house slipped past Sarah's cot without acknowledging her presence, joining the painted figures outside. They'd known. They'd been part of it all along. The figures with raised arms appeared last, walking through the compound gate as if he owned the very air, commanding attention without speaking. He carried no weapons that Sarah could see, but the others deferred to him with gestures that indicated authority beyond mere age or strength. He moved between the bound settlers, painting symbols on their bodies with ochre, speaking in language that rose and fell, like the singing Sarah had heard earlier. Then he looked directly at the kitchen house window, where Sarah stood frozen. Their eyes met across 40 yards of firelit darkness. He raised one hand, not in threat, but in acknowledgement. "You're here. You're seeing this. Remember it truly." The entire ceremony lasted perhaps 2 hours, though Sarah's sense of time had fractured under the weight of what she witnessed. When the painted figures finally left, moving back through the compound gate and disappearing into the scrubland beyond, they took 12 people with them, the Aboriginal workers who'd been branded that evening, now carried or supported by their rescuers, heading toward country where colonial law couldn't follow. The settlers remained tied in the yards, ochre symbols drying on their skin. The cattle brands burned into their flesh, still smoking slightly in the pre-dawn air. Sarah heard Hartwell trying to shout, but his voice emerged as barely more than whisper, as if the ceremony had stolen his ability to command. Malik was silent, his head tilted at an angle that suggested unconsciousness or something deeper. Sarah crept from the kitchen house as the sun rose, finding Bill Corrigan where he'd hidden beneath his supply wagon, eyes wide with terror. Together they debated what to do. Attempt to help the bound settlers, flee immediately, wait for the situation to resolve itself. They chose paralysis, the middle ground between courage and cowardice, staying hidden while the morning heat built and the flies began their work. By noon, everyone in the yards was dead. The cattle brands had become infected with terrifying speed, or perhaps the ceremony itself had carried poison that worked slowly through the bloodstream. Sarah never learned the mechanism, only the result. 23 settlers dead, 12 workers disappeared, and 2 witnesses who'd done nothing to prevent or assist either outcome. When authorities finally arrived 3 weeks later, Sarah told them a carefully edited version of events. Aboriginal attack in the night, overwhelming numbers. She and Corrigan had hidden successfully. No, she hadn't seen the attackers clearly. No, she couldn't identify any individuals. No, she had no idea where they'd gone, or why they'd taken some people and killed others. The magistrate accepted her testimony because the alternative admitting she'd witnessed organized resistance that demonstrated sophisticated planning and moral reasoning would undermine every justification for colonial occupation of Current, the territory. But Sarah Watkins kept a private diary, discovered after her death in 1943, that told the truth she couldn't speak in 1808. They didn't attack. They judged. They held court in those yards, and we all knew the verdict was deserved. I hope God forgives me for my silence. I hope the land forgives me. I hope those 12 people found their way home. The diary revealed one more detail that changed everything about the Cattle Creek Massacre. The figure with raised arms, who'd looked directly at Sarah that night, was someone she'd seen before, months earlier, working as a tracker for the territory police, under the name Tommy Crow. Tommy Crow had been tracking criminals for the territory police since 1903, and in all those years, nobody had questioned why he was so good at finding people who didn't want to be found. Sergeant Hutchinson kept personnel files in a locked cabinet at the Catherine station, thin folders documenting the Aboriginal trackers employed by colonial law enforcement. Tommy Crow's file contained a single page. Approximate age 35, Wardaman country origin, reliable in the field, minimal English, employed on casual basis as needed. The photograph showed a man with careful eyes and a face that revealed nothing, the kind of expression that came from years of watching without being seen to watch. What the file didn't mention was that Tommy Crow was 3 different people, depending on who was looking. To the territory police, he was a useful tracker who could read signs in the landscape that escaped European notice. Broken twigs, disturbed soil, the way birds scattered when humans passed. He found escaped prisoners, located missing prospectors, followed cattle thieves through country where hoofprints disappeared into stone. He worked for payment measured in flour and tobacco, accepted orders in the simplified English that police assumed was the limit of his comprehension, and maintained the careful deference that kept Aboriginal people alive in a system designed to eliminate them. To his own people, he was something else entirely. A messenger who moved between communities, carrying information that couldn't be trusted to European postal systems. A spy who learned colonial plans and weaknesses while pretending not to understand the conversations happening around him. A man who turned his employment with the Territory Police into intelligence gathering that served Aboriginal resistance rather than colonial control. And to a select network of elders across 3 language groups, he was Guburi, the one who brings balance back, a title that carried obligations older than European law, a role that required him to identify those who'd committed crimes against country itself and ensure proper judgment was delivered. The pieces of Tommy Crow's involvement in the Cattle Creek Massacre emerged slowly, scattered across testimony that officials either ignored or actively suppressed, because acknowledging them would require admitting what the Territory administration had created. A man who'd learned to weaponize the very system meant to control him. From sealed police correspondence, April 1908. Tracker Tommy Crow has not reported for duty since January. Last known location near Mataranka. Recommend replacement rather than search. These natives come and go as they please. Sarah Watkins had seen him at Cattle Creek on the night of October 15th, but that wasn't the only time their paths had crossed. In her private diary, she recorded an encounter from 6 months earlier when she'd been traveling to a different station and the supply wagon had stopped at a police camp near Catherine. Tommy Crow had been there, squatting by the fire, eating damper, and apparently paying no attention to the conversations around him. But Sarah had watched him watching, had noticed how his eyes tracked every speaker, how his hands went still when certain topics were discussed, how information seemed to flow into him like water into thirsty ground. She'd thought it odd at the time, but hadn't understood its significance until she saw him again not as Tommy Crow the tracker, but as Guburi the judge, painted for ceremony, commanding the figures who'd entered Cattle Creek Station. With the precision of people who'd been given detailed intelligence about the compound's layout, the settlers' routines, the exact location of every locked door and loaded rifle. Someone had mapped Cattle Creek for the attackers. Someone had told them which settlers were most guilty, which Aboriginal workers needed rescue, when security would be lightest. Someone had turned colonial employment into reconnaissance mission that would end with 23 deaths and 12 liberations. Tommy Crow had visited Cattle Creek Station twice in the months before the massacre, both times officially tracking cattle thieves for the Territory Police. Gerard Malek's ledger mentioned these visits. In passing, police tracker stayed 2 nights. July and Crow returned September. No results on stolen cattle. What the ledger didn't record was how those 2 nights gave Tommy Crow everything he needed: building layouts, work schedules, the location of Hartwell's weapons, the pattern of night watches, and most importantly, the names and faces of Aboriginal workers who'd been branded or beaten, who'd watched family members sold or die, who deserved rescue rather than revenge. The ledger also didn't record the conversations Tommy Crow had in the workers' quarters, speaking languages the settlers didn't understand, building networks of information and trust that would activate when the time came. He taught certain workers to recognize signals, how ceremony songs carried messages about timing and coordination, how to prepare for rescue without alerting their captors, how to stay alive until help arrived, painted in ochre and moving through darkness. Justice moves on. Ceremony time. After the massacre, Tommy Crow disappeared from Territory Police employment, but not from the landscape. Reports of his presence emerged from multiple locations over the following years, sometimes as tracker for Aboriginal communities conducting their own search operations, sometimes as guide for anthropologists studying traditional law, occasionally as ghost story told around station campfires to remind settlers that someone was always watching, always weighing their actions against a law that predated their arrival. In 1912, A district officer named Arthur Pemberton recorded an encounter that never made his official reports. He'd been investigating complaints about Aboriginal workers leaving stations without permission, traveling to Catherine to testify about mistreatment. Pemberton found Tommy Crow camped near the courthouse, waiting to serve as translator for workers who claimed their English was insufficient to give testimony directly, a strategic deployment of supposed ignorance that forced officials to include an Aboriginal voice in proceedings that usually excluded it. I asked him why he'd left police employment, Pemberton wrote in his private journal. He said the work didn't suit him anymore. Then he asked if I'd heard about Cattle Creek Station, about the massacre there 5 years past. I said yes. Terrible business. Aboriginal savagery. He looked at me with something like pity and said, "You people see savagery where we see law. Maybe that's why you keep building on country that doesn't want you." I didn't know how to respond. The journal entry continued. Before he left, Crow told me something I can't stop thinking about. He said every station built on sacred ground, every manager who brands his workers, every time we separate families or deny ceremony, all of it gets recorded, not in our files, but in country itself. He said the land keeps count and eventually collects what's owed. I wanted to dismiss this as superstition, but I keep remembering those 23 bodies hanging in the cattle yards, and I wonder if we're building on borrowed time that's already come due. Tommy Crow's final appearance in European records came in 1928, when an anthropologist named Catherine Berndt interviewed him for a study of traditional law practices. By then, he was an old man, his face carved deep by decades of sun and burden. Berndt asked him about his time working for the territory police, whether he'd ever felt conflicted about serving colonial authorities while maintaining obligations to his own people. His response, recorded in Berndt's field notes: "I wasn't serving two laws. I was serving one law in two different ways. White law says Aboriginal people got no rights. My law says everyone got rights, but also everyone got responsibilities. When those responsibilities get broken badly enough, country demands payback. I helped country collect what was owed. That's all." Berndt pressed him about Cattle Creek specifically, whether rumors were true about his involvement. Tommy Crow smiled and said nothing, the kind of silence that answered questions without risking prosecution under colonial law that still criminalized Aboriginal resistance decades after the events in question. But after the interview concluded and Berndt had put away her notebook, Tommy Crow offered one final comment, casual enough to seem like afterthought. "You know the strangest thing about Cattle Creek? The station never got rebuilt. Land's still empty. Nobody wants to run cattle there anymore. They say it's cursed, that the country itself got poisoned. I think the country's just fine. It's the people who remember what happened there who can't go back. Fear's a powerful teacher. When you finally understand, you're not the only ones keeping score." He died 6 months later, buried in Wardaman country, according to ceremony that transformed his body into landscape, his story into stone, his judgment into precedent that would echo through future generations, who understood that resistance sometimes wore badges and tracked for police while teaching a different lesson entirely. The system could be infiltrated, intelligence could flow both ways, and justice existed in forms that no colonial court would recognize, but that country itself would enforce with patience, measured in seasons rather than sentences. The question that haunted officials who pieced together Tommy Crow's role wasn't whether he'd orchestrated the Cattle Creek Massacre. The evidence suggested he'd been central to planning and executing it, but how many other operations he'd coordinated? How many other station managers had met judgment that looked like accident or natural death? How extensively Aboriginal resistance had organized itself using the very tools meant to control it. The telegram arrived at Government House in Darwin on November 2nd, 1907, 3 sentences that would trigger a coordinated effort to bury the truth about Cattle Creek Station beneath layers of paperwork and manufactured narrative. Massacre confirmed, 23 dead. Evidence suggests organized Aboriginal action with inside knowledge. Request instructions. Territory Administrator James Gilruth read those words in his office overlooking Darwin Harbor, where merchant ships unloaded supplies meant to sustain the colonial expansion that justified his position and salary. He'd spent 5 years convincing investors that the Northern Territory was safe for development, that Aboriginal people could be managed through a combination of employment, rations, and strategic force. Cattle Creek threatened to unravel that narrative, with implications that extended far beyond one station's destruction. Gilruth's response, preserved in sealed government files until 1973, revealed the calculation behind official silence. Minimize Aboriginal organization in all reports. Emphasize spontaneous violence, not planned resistance. Focus on settler victims. Do not mention workers rescued or ceremonial aspects. This must not appear as if Native resistance has capacity for strategic action. The cover-up began with language. Official reports transformed Tommy Crow from intelligence operative into faceless Aboriginal attackers. The rescued workers became accomplices who fled justice. The ceremonial symbols painted on victims' bodies were described as random markings, consistent with primitive superstition. Gerard Malek's skull, discovered in a sacred cave being used as water vessel, was officially documented as missing, presumed destroyed by wild animals. Every detail that suggested Aboriginal people possessed organizational capacity, moral reasoning, or legitimate grievances against settler brutality was systematically removed from public documentation. What remained was a story comfortable for European consumption: savage natives attacking civilized settlers in unprovoked violence that justified increased military presence and stricter control measures. The newspapers received carefully curated information that served colonial interests. Headlines across Australia proclaimed, "Territory Massacre," "Aboriginal treachery claims 23 lives," and "Settlers slaughtered while sleeping." Call for swift justice. None mentioned the branding ceremony that preceded the attack. None questioned why Aboriginal workers had been at the station or what conditions they'd endured. None investigated Tommy Crow's employment history or his convenient absence from subsequent police rosters. From the Adelaide Register, November 15th, 1907. The Cattle Creek tragedy reminds us that the noble savage is a fiction of romantic poets. These are primitive people incapable of understanding civilized values. The territory requires firm governance, not misplaced sympathy. But some officials recognized what they were concealing. District Officer Pemberton, who'd later encountered Tommy Crow near the Catherine Courthouse, wrote to a colleague in Sydney about his concerns. "We're calling this a massacre, but I've reviewed the evidence. The attackers took 12 people alive and delivered them to safety. They left 2 Europeans, the governess and teamster, completely unharmed, despite ample opportunity to kill them. They targeted specific individuals based on documented abuses. This wasn't mindless violence. This was prosecution." The letter never received official response, but Pemberton found himself transferred to administrative duties in Darwin, removed from fieldwork where his observations might continue generating uncomfortable questions. Sarah Watkins faced different pressure. After giving her initial testimony to the magistrate, she received a visit from Gilruth himself, who traveled to Catherine specifically to ensure her story aligned with government interests. The meeting happened in the magistrate's private office. No record kept of what was discussed, but Sarah's subsequent testimony to the official inquiry differed markedly from her first statement. Gone were references to the branding ceremony she'd witnessed. Gone was her description of organized figures moving through the compound with military precision. Gone was any mention of Aboriginal workers being taken alive rather than killed. Her revised account described chaos, darkness, screaming trauma that conveniently prevented detailed observation or identification of specific individuals. Years later, in her private diary, Sarah would write, "Gilruth told me I could choose between two stories. The first was the truth, which would make me unemployable across the territory because no station would hire a governess who testified against settler interests. The second was the story that kept me safe, kept me working, kept me alive. I chose survival. I chose complicity. God will judge me for it. But the Territory Administration has already rewarded me with continued employment. Silence became currency. The 12 Aboriginal workers who'd been rescued from Cattle Creek simply vanished from official concern. No investigation sought their whereabouts. No charges were filed for their theft from station property. The administration preferred to treat them as if they'd never existed, which, in a sense, they hadn't, since station records had listed them by number rather than name, as assets rather than people whose disappearance required explanation or justice. Meanwhile, the actual investigation stalled in ways that suggested deliberate obstruction rather than incompetence. Evidence disappeared from police storage photographs that Constable Farnsworth had taken of the ceremonial symbols. Samples of ochre paint that might have been traced to specific country. Tommy Crow's employment file that would have revealed his previous visits to Cattle Creek Station. What remained was exactly enough documentation to support the official narrative while preventing deeper inquiry. When Farnsworth protested the evidence tampering, suggesting that someone in the administration was actively preventing thorough investigation, he found himself facing disciplinary review for unprofessional conduct and conspiracy-minded speculation. He resigned in 1909 and moved to Queensland, taking his private journal with him, the journal that would eventually reveal what had been suppressed. The cover-up extended to Aboriginal communities themselves. Gilruth ordered increased police presence around Wardaman and Jawoyn country, not to investigate the massacre, but to intimidate potential witnesses. Trackers who'd worked with Tommy Crow were questioned repeatedly about his whereabouts, threatened with imprisonment if they provided false information, though what constituted false was defined entirely by whether it supported or contradicted official narratives. Some communities responded with strategic ignorance, claiming Tommy Crow had died years ago or had never existed, or was actually 3 different people whose names got confused in European records. Others employed ceremonial law that prevented them from speaking about certain matters, a protection that colonial authorities couldn't legally override without admitting Aboriginal law had legitimacy, which would undermine their entire justification for occupation. The most effective resistance to the cover-up came from unexpected sources: missionaries who'd spent decades learning Aboriginal languages and customs, who'd earned enough trust to hear stories that European officials would never access. They documented accounts of the Cattle Creek attack that painted dramatically different pictures from government reports. Stories of workers branded like cattle, of families separated, of deaths from mistreatment that preceded the massacre by months. One missionary, Father Bernard Walsh, wrote to the Archbishop of Sydney in 1908, "The administration calls Cattle Creek a massacre. The Aboriginal people I serve call it judgment. Having heard testimony from both sides, I fear the judgment was justified. And what truly horrifies the government is not the deaths themselves, but the demonstration that Aboriginal people possess sophisticated concepts of justice and the organizational capacity to enforce them." Walsh's letter triggered his recall to Sydney, where church authorities reminded him that missions depended on government funding and shouldn't undermine colonial authority with inflammatory observations about Aboriginal capabilities or settler abuses. By 1910, the Cattle Creek Massacre had been effectively sealed, official reports filed, evidence controlled, witnesses silenced through pressure or transfer, and public narrative established that served administrative interests while preventing accountability for the conditions that had triggered the attack. The station itself remained abandoned, gradually reclaimed by scrub and termites, a ghost property that no investor wanted to purchase despite prime grazing land and existing infrastructure. Some said it was cursed. Others said the cattle wouldn't fatten there anymore, that something in the water or soil had turned wrong. But people who understood country knew the truth. The land had judged and found the station wanting, and would not support that kind of occupation again. You could force cattle onto sacred ground, but you couldn't force country to forget what had been done there. The cover-up worked in every official sense. Court records, newspaper archives, government files, all told the story that administrators wanted preserved. But they couldn't control the stories told around fires in Aboriginal camps, passed through generations as lesson and warning. Resistance was possible, judgment could be delivered. And sometimes the land itself would side with those who'd been dispossessed, because country remembered loyalty deeper than any European claim of ownership. In 1935, a young anthropologist named Donald Thompson traveled through Wardaman country collecting oral histories. An elder told him about Cattle Creek, about Guburi the judge, about how one man had learned to move between worlds while serving a law that predated colonial occupation. Thompson asked if such organized resistance had occurred elsewhere in the territory. The elder smiled and pointed at the landscape, vast, ancient, patient. You think Cattle Creek was special? That was country teaching one lesson. How many other lessons you think got taught where your people don't keep records? Thompson never published that interview, understanding that some truths were safer left in the margins of official history, where they could nourish resistance without triggering the kind of response that would destroy the communities who'd preserved them. 87 years after the massacre, a young Wardaman woman named Jennifer Daniels stood in the abandoned cattle yards at what used to be Cattle Creek Station, holding a GPS unit and a folder of historical documents that the territory government had finally declassified in 1994. The compound had returned almost entirely to scrub termite-hollowed posts marking where buildings once stood, rusted wire tangled in ghost gums. The cattle yards themselves collapsed into geometric suggestions beneath native grasses. But the landscape remembered. Jennifer could feel it in the way certain birds avoided the area, how the air held differently here, heavier somehow, as if saturated with events that physics couldn't measure, but country could absorb. She was there documenting massacre sites for the Northern Territory Aboriginal Heritage Commission, part of a broader effort to acknowledge colonial violence that had been denied or minimized for generations. Her grandmother had told her about Cattle Creek, about Guburi the judge, about how resistance had sometimes worn police badges and spoken languages that settlers assumed they couldn't understand. Now, Jennifer was matching oral history against declassified files, finding where they converged and where official silence had created gaps that only Aboriginal memory could fill. The GPS coordinates placed her exactly where Constable Farnsworth's photographs showed bodies hanging in 1907. She took her own photographs, now empty yards, reclaimed land, a memorial plaque that the commission would install, acknowledging what had happened here. The plaque's text had required 3 years of negotiation between government officials who wanted sanitized language and Aboriginal communities who demanded truth. The final wording read, "At this site in October 1907, 23 people died following conflict between settlers and Aboriginal peoples. 12 Aboriginal workers were removed from the station by their communities." This event reflects the violent dispossession of traditional owners and the resistance that emerged from systematic abuse. Bureaucratic language that still couldn't say the words judgment, justice, payback. From Jennifer Daniels' field notes, October 19, 94. Standing where my ancestors delivered consequences, I feel something I didn't expect. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but sadness that it came to this. That they were pushed so far that 23 deaths seemed like the only language settlers would understand. She walked to where the workers' quarters had stood, finding artifacts that archaeologists would later catalog. Metal ration tokens, fragments of clay pipes, a child's toy carved from wood, evidence of lives lived in the margins of official records, people who'd existed as numbered assets until the night they were transformed into subjects of rescue rather than objects of property. The cave where Gerard Malek's skull had been found still existed 15 miles northwest, though access was now restricted to Wardaman people conducting ceremony. Jennifer had visited it once with her grandmother, who'd shown her the paintings documenting the massacre, not the famous ones that government archaeologists had photographed, but others in deeper chambers that required crawling through passages barely wide enough for human bodies, paintings that showed not just the attack itself, but its context. Workers branded, families separated, children dying from malnutrition and disease. "This is our history book," her grandmother had said, touching ochre handprints that stretched back thousands of years. "Your people write things down and put them in buildings that can burn. We write on stone that outlasts empires." The oral histories Jennifer collected for the commission revealed details that challenged even the declassified official reports. Multiple elders described Tommy Crow not as lone actor, but as coordinator of a network that had monitored station abuses across the territory for years, that had attempted peaceful intervention through mission complaints and police reports before determining that colonial law would never protect Aboriginal workers from settler violence. Cattle Creek hadn't been spontaneous or even isolated. It was one operation in what might be called a campaign of resistance that used targeted judgment against the worst offenders while avoiding the kind of indiscriminate violence that would trigger military retaliation. The administration had covered up Cattle Creek, partly from embarrassment, but also from fear. Acknowledging sophisticated Aboriginal resistance would require admitting that dispossession faced organized opposition rather than primitive reaction. Country keeps count, always has, always will. One elder, a man named George Jameson, who was 6 years old when his grandfather told him about Cattle Creek in 1938, shared something that made Jennifer stop her recording and simply listen. "My grandfather said Goobery didn't want to kill those settlers. Said he tried other ways, first told mission people, told police about the branding, even wrote letters that nobody thought an Aboriginal man could write. But every time, the system protected the station owners. So finally he stopped asking European law for justice and started using the law that was here before them. He said sometimes you have to speak in a language people actually hear, even if it's the last language you want to use." The implications troubled Jennifer, not because she doubted Aboriginal people had the right to defend themselves against brutality, but because acknowledging armed resistance complicated narratives that both Aboriginal communities and sympathetic settlers preferred. Stories of Aboriginal people as pure victims, never aggressors, suffering without striking back. The truth was messier. Resistance had taken multiple forms, some passive, and some decidedly not. Some that history could comfortably celebrate, and some that required wrestling with the moral complexity of violence. Meeting violence. In 2007, the 100-year anniversary of the massacre, the Northern Territory government held an official ceremony at the Cattle Creek site. Politicians gave speeches about reconciliation and acknowledging past wrongs. Aboriginal elders performed welcome to country and smoking ceremony. Descendants of settlers and descendants of Aboriginal workers stood together in what media coverage described as healing, but Jennifer noticed what wasn't said. Nobody mentioned Tommy Crow by name. Nobody described the branding ceremony that preceded the attack. Nobody acknowledged that what happened at Cattle Creek was response to specific abuses rather than random violence. The ceremony allowed people to feel reconciled without requiring them to confront what reconciliation actually demanded: accountability for systems that had created conditions where massacre seemed like the only available justice. After the official ceremony ended, Jennifer and several other Aboriginal people conducted their own private ritual at the site, speaking names that had been erased from records. The 12 workers who'd been rescued, whose survival was as much part of the story as the 23 who died. They poured water on the ground where the workers' quarters had stood, singing in language that their grandparents had kept alive, despite mission schools designed to eliminate it, performing acknowledgement that government ceremonies couldn't provide. An old woman named Phyllis, whose grandmother had been one of the 12 rescued from Cattle Creek, told Jennifer something that wouldn't appear in any official history. "My grandmother lived until 1968. Died free, died with her family, died speaking her own language. She said the night they came for her at Cattle Creek, she wasn't afraid. She'd been waiting. They all had been waiting. And when they saw Goobaree painted for ceremony, they knew judgment had finally arrived for the people who thought they could do anything to blackfellas without consequence." The story of Cattle Creek continued rippling forward in unexpected ways. In 2015, archaeology students from Darwin discovered additional evidence at the site, not the massacre itself, but what happened after. Aboriginal people had returned repeatedly to conduct ceremony, leaving deposits of ochre, grinding stones, carved message sticks. The site had been transformed from place of colonial occupation into place of Aboriginal remembrance, country reclaiming itself through ritual repetition that said, "This land was never truly taken, never truly lost, never truly anything, except Aboriginal, despite the buildings and fences that temporarily occupied it." The students also found something that triggered federal investigation. Evidence that the station's water supply had been deliberately contaminated in the weeks before the massacre. Subtle poisoning that would have weakened settlers without killing them outright, that would have made them easier targets when the final judgment came. The sophistication required for such preparation, understanding dosages, timing, how to avoid detection, suggested Tommy Crow, or someone with similar knowledge had spent months preparing the ground for what would happen in October 1907. The investigation went nowhere. Too much time had passed. Too many people were dead. And pursuing it would require admitting things about Aboriginal resistance that mainstream Australian history still wasn't ready to acknowledge. That it had been strategic, sophisticated, and in cases like Cattle Creek, arguably justified by any standard of proportional response to extreme human rights violations. Today, if you visit the Cattle Creek site, you'll find Jennifer Daniels' plaque and a small interpretive center explaining what happened there. School groups come to learn about frontier violence. Tourists photograph the ruins and talk about the complexity of colonial history. But if you come at certain times during ceremony season, when the land feels most alive, you might encounter Aboriginal people conducting private rituals that don't require explanation to outsiders, maintaining connections to country and story that government recognition can neither grant nor revoke. And sometimes, people report seeing a figure on the ridge overlooking the old cattle yards, a man painted for ceremony, watching, as if ensuring the judgment delivered in 1907 continues to be remembered, continues to mean something, continues to remind settlers and their descendants that every acre of Australian land carries memory of what was done to obtain it and what resistance emerged to challenge that doing. Researchers dismiss these sightings as legend, as projection, as the human tendency to see patterns in landscape shadows. But Aboriginal people who know the stories understand differently. Goobaree isn't haunting Cattle Creek. He's holding it accountable, ensuring that even as buildings crumble and official records fade, the land itself remembers and speaks for those who were silenced. Some say on still October nights, you can hear singing from the direction of the workers' quarters, voices in languages that predate English by tens of thousands of years, carrying messages about justice and judgment, and the patient certainty that country outlasts all occupation, all violence, all attempts to erase what happened there. But local Waterman people will tell you that's not ghosts singing. It's just country, doing what country does, remembering everything, forgetting nothing, waiting as long as necessary for truth to surface, like water finding its way through limestone, slow and inevitable and impossible to permanently contain. The last person to see the cave paintings before they were closed to public access, was a documentary filmmaker named Marcus Chen, who received special permission from Wardaman elders in 2019 to photograph the deepest chambers for a film about frontier violence that would never be completed. Chen descended through passages that narrowed until he was crawling on his belly. Limestone pressing against his shoulders, carbide lamp throwing shadows that made the walls seem to breathe. When he finally emerged into the main gallery, the same chamber where Dutch Heinrich had found Gerard Malek's skull in 1908, he understood why elders had hesitated before granting access. The paintings weren't just historical documentation, they were prophecy. The familiar images were there. Upside-down figures, marked with brand symbols. The raised arms judge presiding over ceremony. The 12 rescued workers being led away to safety. But in the gallery's farthest corner, partially obscured by mineral deposits that suggested great age, Chen found paintings that depicted scenes from the future, or what would have seemed like the future in 1907. Buildings taller than any that existed in the territory then. Roads cutting through country in patterns that matched modern highways. And figures in contemporary clothing standing at what Chen recognized as the Cattle Creek Memorial Site, conducting ceremony while painted ancestors watched from the ridge. "How is this possible?" Chen asked the elder who'd accompanied him, a man named David Nabarlambarl, whose grandfather had known Tommy Crow personally. David studied the paintings with an expression that suggested he'd expected this question. Time works different in ceremony space, past and future. They're not separate like you people think. Country sees everything at once. What was done, what's being done now, what will need to be done later. These paintings, they're not predicting. They're showing what country already knows. The judgment at Cattle Creek wasn't an ending. It was a beginning of something that's still happening. From Marcus Chen's production notes, August 2019. I came here expecting to document history. Instead, I'm confronting the possibility that Aboriginal understanding of time and consequence operates on scales that Western frameworks can't accommodate. Either these paintings are elaborate hoax, which seems impossible given their location and mineral overlay, or something about this place exists outside conventional chronology. Chen's footage showed one more detail that would trouble him for years afterward. In the paintings depicting contemporary ceremony at Cattle Creek, one figure stood apart from the others, painted differently, watching with what seemed like satisfaction. The figure matched descriptions of Tommy Crow from historical records, but couldn't possibly be him. He died in 1928, 91 years before Chen's visit. Unless the paintings weren't depicting Tommy Crow specifically, but the role he'd embodied, Guburi, the one who brings balance back, a position that might be held by different people across generations, continuing the work of judgment and accountability that Cattle Creek had demonstrated was possible. The film was never completed because Chen's funding fell through, but more truthfully because he couldn't reconcile what he'd seen in that cave with the documentary framework he'd planned. How do you explain paintings that seem to violate causality? How do you present evidence that suggests Aboriginal law operates according to principles that Western science considers impossible? The easier choice was to archive the footage and move on to projects that didn't challenge fundamental assumptions about how reality works. But the footage existed, stored in the Northern Territory archives, available to researchers who knew how to request it. Jennifer Daniels had watched it 17 times, each viewing revealing new details that suggested Cattle Creek's significance extended beyond one massacre in 1907, beyond even the cover-up and gradual acknowledgement that followed. The event had become something larger, a demonstration that Aboriginal resistance possessed capabilities that colonizers had never fully suppressed, that judgment could be delivered outside European legal systems. That country itself participated in holding people accountable for violations that courts refused to recognize. In 2023, during a ceremony at Cattle Creek marking 116 years since the massacre, something unprecedented happened. A young Wardaman man named Jake Miller, who'd been raised partially in Darwin with limited connection to traditional practice, suddenly began speaking in language he'd never learned, his voice taking on qualities that reminded elders of recordings they'd heard of Tommy Crow. The words that came through him carried messages about stations that still operated on sacred ground, about mining companies violating sites they'd been warned to avoid, about the ongoing need for judgment when colonial law continued protecting violators rather than country. The elders present recognized what was happening. Ceremony transmission, the way knowledge and authority could move through individuals prepared to receive it, connecting them to roles and responsibilities that transcended individual lifetimes. Jake Miller had become, temporarily or permanently, a vessel for the same force that had operated through Tommy Crow, not possession in any supernatural sense, but activation of capacity that existed within Aboriginal law, within country itself, within the continuous thread of resistance that Cattle Creek had demonstrated was possible. Some white Australians who learned about this dismissed it as theater or delusion, but Aboriginal communities understood it as continuation. The work Tommy Crow had begun wasn't finished, because the conditions that made Cattle Creek necessary, dispossession, abuse of workers, violations of sacred sites, hadn't ended. Different forms, same fundamental disrespect. And so the role of Goobaree remained necessary, would remain necessary, as long as country required defending. The Northern Territory government monitored Jake Miller carefully after that ceremony, though they couldn't articulate what crime they suspected he might commit. Speaking in language at a memorial site wasn't illegal. Claiming to carry forward Tommy Crow's legacy wasn't prosecutable. But the administration recognized threat in ways their predecessors had in 1907. Aboriginal people demonstrating organizational capacity, moral authority, and willingness to enforce consequences outside colonial systems meant power was never as consolidated as settlers liked to believe. In the years since Cattle Creek, Australia had apologized for the stolen generations, acknowledged frontier massacres, established truth-telling commissions, institutional recognition that violence and injustice had occurred. But acknowledgement without structural change, without returning land or sovereignty, without ceding authority to Aboriginal law, meant the fundamental relationship remained colonial. Settlers deciding how much truth to admit, when to admit it, and what consequences would follow, which was usually none. Cattle Creek suggested a different model. Aboriginal people determining when colonial law had failed, when their own law needed to be enforced, when judgment required delivery, regardless of whether settlers consented or even understood what was happening. This model terrified administrators then and now because it implied Aboriginal authority existed independent of colonial permission, could be exercised without colonial approval, and would continue operating as long as violations continued occurring. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.